there's all this interesting stuff on Arweave, and there's all these worlds and all these people. So you're kind of trying to connect the dots, but in a different way, making it so that stuff is not just mysteriously out there. Is that part of it?
One like design goal that I have is like breaking these big picture things down into tiny little builds, and have those builds be able to provide value and have utility like right now, and not be like, oh, we're going to build this for 3 years and release it, but like build it in public, build it with community, and have each one of these different like access points, I guess you could say, like have a real utility and value for that people would attribute value to.
You're tuned to the ArCast, where we talk about the blockchain on the ArCast and how your data remains the ArCast, where ArDrive is the topic, censorship resistant permanence. Yeah, we got it. Wow, that intro was different, Andrew. What's the story with that? I'm glad you asked, listener. Hello, welcome to episode 19 of the ArCast. My guest this week, Ryan, not only is he an innovator, a healer, someone who's continued to take risks and find community and do big things, he's also a musician and a beatboxer. So we were like, what if we did a little remix of the intro song for this episode? So I thought that was tight. We linked at the Arweave Build Gather Town a few months ago, and he was a really interesting, sweet guy. And so we started talking about ways ArDrive and RIO could help his project. He's been working on Spider, and we talk about exactly what that project is, how we got there, and it was a really good interview. So enjoy this week's episode of the ArCast. Inferno was still burning, super hot. So if you want to participate, just all you have to do is keep uploading, and if you're in the top 50, uploading 100 megabytes or more, you'll get those sweet ArDrive tokens. We're starting to do TikTok stuff. What? Permanent data storage and TikTok? That sounds like a crazy confluence. Trust me, it's going to be tight. So follow us on TikTok. We've got one for the news and one for crazy whatever. 2 accounts. We'll be posting there routinely. We're going to be at the Gathering of the Juggalos, August 3rd to August 7th. I'm putting out a mixtape with MC Snacks for the event that's stored via ArDrive. That's right. So we just like letting all these different communities know that ArDrive is censorship resistant, permanent, accessible, easy. And so it's going to be a fun week. So we hope to see you there. Come say hi. This episode is brought to you by Memory Gardens, which secures your memories for 200 years through Arweave on a platform that you can experience with a VR headset, mobile device, or computer. Listen to last episode for information. We did a whole episode on Memory Gardens on episode 18. So check that out. This is my interview with Ryan. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the ArCast. I'm talking to Ryan, the creator of Spider. He just presented at the Open Web Foundry. We linked in the community because, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, it was one of the gather towns for Arweave Build a few months ago.
Yeah, you were the first person I met, and like could be the first person I've talked to online in a very, very long time. I went and saw Arweave Build day one, and I was like super paranoid. And the first thing I came out the gate saying in the chat was like, hey, I'm interested in working on a people-powered search engine if anybody wants to talk about it. And I pressed the button. I had this mini anxiety attack, and I pressed the button. I was like, oh, okay, here we go. And then right after in the meet and greet, you came up to me and started talking. You were like the first one, and made me feel comfortable. And I thought you like were on the Arweave core team or something, but yeah, man, props to you for making me feel comfortable, and immediately I felt like I was in the community. So it's cool.
It's like the thing about joining the Arweave Build is that it takes courage, right? To pitch it and to get in there and ask questions. And so it's fun to come in and see how we can help people with what they're building and what they're doing. Because what I really like about the Arweave community is it has this vibe of the early internet. Like everyone is new to it. We're trying to help each other out. It always feels like freshman orientation at college. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Only as little pixelated characters in a game. My daughters like would come in, and I'm inside a gather town. They're like, "You working right now?" I'm like, "I'm not making any money, but technically I guess this is work."
You're a musician. You were saying how you started playing in a church band?
Well, I've been playing drums, I guess, since I could sit up. So like 2 years old, pots and pans type thing. And basically just like, I'm one of those people that just have music and beats floating around in my head all the time, and just needed a way to get it out. And I just became like a drummer and a beatboxer my whole life. It wasn't until I went to high school and started listening to like, I don't know, Tribe Called Quest and hip hop that I realized, Rozelle and stuff, that I realized like, oh, this beatbox thing is like, it's a real thing. And I'd go to these high school parties, and I went to like a very diverse high school, and it was like all the big senior guys, like football players and whatever, they'd be like having these ciphers battling each other. And I'd be this little dorky, like band geek freshman. They'd pull me in to beatbox, whatever. So I kind of used music as a tool, like just by accident. It's like my way of expression and connecting with people. But yeah, I was in a metal band. We were trying to be like, basically like Tool meets Deftones type thing. And yeah, I guess I'll tell you the whole genesis story. So, because I think all of this plays together, and the problem one, I guess, like my unique background is like the first time in my life that everything's coming together. That I'm using all of my past failures and creative pursuits. It's like it's all centering in on this thing that I'm working on now. So yeah, so I was in a metal band, and we were good. It's like we were like mathy and all this stuff. And long story short, I think I was like 19 or so, and I basically snuck my way into Interscope Records as my band's drummer and lawyer and manager. And I actually like bought or rented a limo so I could get dropped off at Interscope. I like flew across the country, got dropped off at Interscope in a limo just for the off chance that somebody would see me get out of the limo. Basically snuck my way into Interscope, and I was in the vice president of Interscope Records office. This is at the time that like Eminem was huge and all that stuff. And I just had this moment of like, I am not in any control of my life or my three best friends. And I just was overcome with like fear. And I was just like, I need a backup plan. So we didn't end up getting signed anyways, but it was in that moment I was just like, I need a backup plan. And at that time, it was like when video games were moving to disc, like PlayStation 1, and they were projecting that the video game industry was going to, make more money than film and music combined, which has happened. And for me as like a musician, I understood that by this video game medium being put on a disc, on a DVD, that soundtracks for video games weren't going to be like this blippy, like type music. We're going to have the ability to have full orchestral scores and all this kind of stuff. So I was like, all right, this is the move. I need to figure out like how to go about doing this. So I went to a school called Full Sail, which is like a media arts school in Florida that you can go for audio engineering and video games and film, all sorts of crazy stuff. So I went there for audio engineering, but my intent, it's like I went 7 days a week and sat in on all the video game classes too. And in my head, what I heard was like, or what I assumed I should say was like this ability for video games to step into environments and for the music, for the soundtrack to change depending on what room you're in, what sword you pick up, how you're fighting or whatever. I just assumed like, all right, now we're going to disc, like this music can be generative and adapt and change depending on what's happening in the game. And I was like maybe 7 months into school, and I went and talked. I was like actually in like sitting in on an audio for video games class, and I talked to the instructor, and I was like, so how do you go about like doing this programming? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, the only thing you could do right now is taking like 30-second like MP3 file and like looping it. He's like, you can't do this like generative reactive, like the sound engines don't do this. And here I am, like spent all this money. I dragged my two buddies from my metal band down to Florida with me. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you gotta be kidding me. So long story short, I went through this whole program, did well, but then, and the other crazy thing is like the last 2 weeks of school, I got this opportunity to understudy this dude named Billy Ashbog, who at the time was playing for like Britney Spears and NSYNC and stuff like that when they were huge. And so I was like taking drum lessons from him basically. And he's like, what are you doing? I told him, I'm going Full Sail for audio engineering. And he said, why? He's like, why are you 21 and working on your plan B, backup plan? He's like, you need to be like a professional drummer. And it's like, and you know, you don't have to just be in a band. You can be like me and tour the world for pop musicians, whatever. So that guy rocked my world, literally like the last couple of weeks of school. And I started looking into like all these pop musicians, and I realized like 99% of them were all like black dudes that came up in the gospel church. And I was just like, how am I going to like, and it's like the same people playing for all these people, you know, Usher or whatever. It's like they all are in these niche of communities in San Francisco and all over the country, but this like black gospel church niche. And I was just like, how am I going to like infiltrate this community? And so anyways, I ended up getting this crazy job. At the time, I'm from Rhode Island, but I was living in Boston, and I got this crazy. I snuck into an interview for DigiDesign, the company that makes Pro Tools now called Avid. But Berkeley was hosting a career expo to fill a position. I snuck my way in there. Didn't go to Berkeley. Went in there basically to complain about Pro Tools, and got a call a few hours later saying you got the gig if you can be in LA in 6 weeks. So I drive out to LA and had this amazing opportunity to work for DigiDesign, now called Avid, as kind of like what they call the foot soldier, basically being the eyes and the ears of the community, of the company on the ground, and going to studios and talking to producers and figuring out how we can make the software better and blah, 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 blah. So this whole time I'm there, I'm like, this is great. It's like the most amazing gig in the world. I'm getting to like go into all these communities and studios and do demos and all that stuff, all these places that I would have no reason to be in this place at all. Like I'm nothing special, but all of a sudden it's like people want to be my friend because I work for this company or whatever. But at the same time, I'm like, I'm a drummer. It's like I came out here to play drums. So one day I was doing like a demo of this virtual instrument software, and this dude comes up to me, this big black dude. He's like, man, you play keys in church? And I was like, no. He's like, well, you gotta come to my church. And I was like, okay, like this is my in, right? So I go, and it's in Compton, and I'm the only white dude there. And the musicians are just ridiculous. Like, I think the drummer wasn't there because he was playing for Mariah Carey or whatever. There's like 16-year-old that ended up getting plucked out by Nas. So I'm sitting there. It's like, I grew up like Roman Catholic, and I'm in this church in Compton. And it's like, you know, people clapping and dancing and jumping around, all this stuff. And I was just like, I felt like I was in a movie. And I'm sitting there with like a mohawk mullet and like a tweed jacket, but that's my grandfather's. I'm like sweating. And at the end of the service, the preacher's like, do we have any visitors here today? And I was just like, God, if you are real, get me out of here. And so the lady next to me stands me up. I walk to the front of the altar, and he turns me around and faces me to the people. And there are probably 200 of probably the poorest people in the whole entire country, just like on their feet, like praying for me. And that moment it rocked me. Like I like felt God's love, and I felt community for the first time. And it's like my perspective in that moment changed from like me trying to like be on this journey of like, you know, climbing this ladder to like, for the first time I like felt like a part of community. And I was like the only white guy and all this stuff, but whatever. So I had this like heart change and decided to move back to Rhode Island. I ended up becoming like an inner city youth pastor at another church. I was the only white guy, and just really started getting a heart for like inner city kids that didn't really have a chance and were kind of destined to like be caught in this cycle. So I'm still working with a music tech company, and started like volunteering with some friends, and adopted this elementary school, and just did like, I was doing like beat making classes in this elementary school, and with a bunch of like crazy artist friends. The school went from like one of the worst performing in the city to one of the best performing in the state. And it was the principal attributed it because of the community that we were building. And like, they would literally have to call the fire marshal on parent teacher nights because they would have, you know, a couple hundred parents wanting to come, which was unheard of. Right. So again, this idea of community and figuring out how to connect with people that weren't me, a completely different type of community. So then I got a call. At this time, it's like I kind of stepped up the ladder. I was U.S. marketing manager, and I got a call from the guy that was head of the arts for the city. And he was like, Ryan, you know, we just built this multi-million-dollar high school, but it's failing. It was the most state-of-the-art schools in the country at the time. It's like, we need somebody to come in who understands technology to help change, to give the school vision. So I leave my career. He's like, are you interested? I said, no. And at the time I thought I was crushing it. And I was like, no, I'm not interested. But I prayed about it. And I'm like, all right, I gotta make this move. So I changed my career, go to work for the school. And I was a creative technologist. And the problem that the school was having is that kids were expected to make a career decision. It was like a career and technical high school, right? So kids were expected to make a career decision on what they want to do for the rest of their life from like a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation when they're in 8th grade. And thus they had the wrong kids in the wrong seats for their whole high school career, trying to be an electrician or an engineer, or whatever it is. So I quickly realized this problem, and I was like, all right, we need to, and I had this marketing background. I'm like, we need to figure out how to, for these kids to be able to like search and discover their interests and their passions way before they have to make a decision on what they do. So I made this software called Improved, and it was basically like this video-based search and discovery tool where kids could like explore different career paths. And I had the kids themselves making the videos of like designing 3D printing iPhone cases, all this crazy stuff. And so that by the time, and I literally like went into the middle schools and were like drilling TVs on the lunchrooms, like totally against code, so that I could like pull in all this media and stuff in the lunchrooms. But anyways, so I created this thing, and I was really excited about it. And then I realized like Facebook was doing the same thing. And so I flew out to California and met with their engineering team. And I just realized like they're also working on this like personalized education, like search and discovery mechanism to figure out what motivates a young person's interest or whatever. And then I was just like kind of making these calculations in my head. I'm like, all right, but where does that stop? It's like at what point are you gathering interest about somebody when they're 15 or 10, painting this picture? So anyways, I got really frustrated by that. And I just had this mentality of like, I'm not going to beat Facebook. It's like, they're way out ahead of me. They're building this stuff inside of Facebook headquarters. And I just got really down and depressed. And my wife kind of called me out, and she's like, you need to, she's like, maybe it's time to be a musician. We were like, we're going to move back to LA or Nashville. And I told her, I was like, if we move to Nashville, we're going to be living on ramen noodles for 10 years for me to be like a producer or drummer, right? So we decided to do that. And in the interim, we go down to New Jersey, where my wife's from, and I end up meeting this guy who has this amazing studio. And he is like, meets me, asks me my story. I tell him my story. He's like, well, someone just donated an oversized school bus to this music foundation. We need someone to turn it into a state-of-the-art recording studio and go out and find the next generation of like inner city kids that are the musicians that are going to represent the city. And he's like, you're the guy. And I was like, what? Like, what? What are you talking about? I went back, told my wife, and decided to do that. So we moved down to New Jersey. I had to go to truck driving school. After I moved my family down, they're like, oh yeah, you got to go to truck driving school. So I grew this crazy mustache, long mustache just to survive in truck driving school, and built this crazy bus. And we got sponsors, Sennheiser and Rolly and all sorts of crazy sponsors. It was like the most state-of-the-art studio on wheels. And the idea was for me to like go out and build community through this bus in different schools and boys and girls clubs and all this kind of stuff. So at that point, I kind of recognized another problem that I'm trying to solve right now. And that is like this idea of discovering and being recommended content. So on this thing, it's called the Beat Bus. Before we get into like making beats, I'd always ask the kids like, well, what kind of music do you listen to? And this was like a way for me as like a late 30s white dude to like relate to these kids. And it could be, all age kids, but inner city kids, right? With tough situations. So 99% of the time it was always like SoundCloud, like trap rappers. And it didn't matter if it was like Kindergarten Girl or like some kid that just got out of juvie. I would just like, I got really good at knowing like all these like underground, like trap rappers. But I was thinking to myself, it's like, all right, like my generation was like, my parents listened to music on records, and my generation was like tapes and CDs and then the iPod. And I thought like with this generation, you would think these kids would have the world of music to search and discover. at any given time. But then I realized after asking this question hundreds of times, like I had over 5,000, the seats were filled over 5,000 times on the bus. And I asked this question every single time. And so I had this thesis of like, why are all these kids just listening to one style of music when they have the world of music at their fingertips via YouTube and Spotify or whatever? And what I realized in asking this question hundreds of times is that these kids were just being algorithmically recommended the same type of music. And this light bulb went off in my head. It's like, yeah, Spotify is not incentivized to recommend new types of music to them. YouTube's not incentivized to recommend new types of stuff to further their interests. They're algorithmically like trapped in a trap bubble to keep their attention and aka make the more time you spend on a platform, the more money they make. So I tried to combat that by like, and these kids never heard jazz, like just stuff. So I'd try to combat this with this idea of like introducing them to different styles of music loops. And it's like, all right, you want to make a trap beat, you got to start with this punk rock guitar first and crazy stuff like that. So I did that. And then all of a sudden, right before COVID hit, I asked the same question, right? And this is the part of the story where I get red pilled into Web3. So I asked this question, like, what are you guys listening to? And for years, I've been doing it for 2 or 3 years, I hear, trap rappers. And all of a sudden, everybody from the kindergarten girl to the kid that just got out of juvie, I said, what are you guys listening to right now? And all of a sudden, they all said Marshmello. And I'm like, the EDM producer? They're like, yeah. And then like the second day of me asking the same question, same response. And I was like, how? What? Like, I was so confused. I'm like, why are you listening? Yeah, I had no idea. So I'm like, so how? And they're like, oh, we went to the Marshmello show. And that's how they phrased it over a different time. We went to the Marshmello. So I was like, oh, he played around here? And they're like, no, he played in Fortnite. And I was like, what? Like my head was just like, right? And completely blew my mind. And I was just like, this is the scariest and saddest and kind of coolest thing I've ever heard. And then me as this old guy, like I had to check myself, and then I researched it and all this stuff. And I'm just like a concert in a video game, millions of people at the same time watching this, whatever. And I had to check myself. And first I was like, this is stupid. This is absolutely ridiculous. And then I realized like, one, from a record label perspective, it's like, what's the main thing that you can do to put your artist in front of the biggest audience possible? It's like the Super Bowl, right? But your demographic of the Super Bowl is like fatties like me that don't care about the Weeknd or whoever it is, right? So from like a content delivery perspective as a label, it's like now you can put your artist in front of a video game and in front of 99.9% of your exact demographic that's going to buy tickets and buy merch in the video game, blah, blah, blah. And then I also thought like in my day, I got exposed to new music and like Tony Hawk, right? And it's the same thing. So anyways, so then COVID hits and I'm doing a Zoom with one of my kids. And as I'm Zooming with him, he's got his face like super close to the screen. And I was like, X, either I'm the most interesting teacher you have or you're playing a video game. And he's like, yeah, Mr. Ryan, I'm playing a video game. And then all of a sudden in that moment, I was like, we got to figure out how to make like a quote unquote, like metaverse music experience. So I was like, it's light bulb moment off. I was like, X, are you down to build like a virtual music venue? And he was like, yeah. And the kid's like super nerd. He's like, yeah, I got you. And I'm like, okay. So then, I had no idea. I'm just like making this up as I go along. So then I set out on this journey with like these 10 or so kids, I call them my ninjas, on how to figure out how to make like a 3D virtual music venue, but with a couple different things. So like this idea of metaverse shows, it's like, it's an avatar inside of Fortnite. They're pre-recording it, like, Marshmello, whatever, jumping around in a suit, like a motion capture suit. They pre-record it, press play on a server, and that pre-recorded performance, like, basically is distributed out. And they do that for bandwidth reasons and all this kind of stuff. But with this, I'm like, we're not doing avatars. I was like, we need to figure out how to put real musicians playing live inside of a video game environment. So we set out, and that's all we had was like an iPad, a laptop, a green screen. We had like, $2,000 worth of stuff, and most of that was the laptop. And we were remote, and so I ended up taking gear off the bus and dropping it off at the kid's house. It's like, all right, let's figure out how to do this. So with the limited tools we had, we figured out these like open source technologies. Long story short, like got to a point where we modeled the town square of our city in VR, because we didn't have time to learn Blender and all this stuff. So we modeled it in VR. I recognized like all these futurists that are designing sneakers and cars and all this kind of stuff. They're like actually designing in VR now. So I'm like, all right, let's jump the whole Blender stuff, model in VR, design it in VR. And so we created this world in VR and then built a stage and all these different things. Like, how do you do virtual lighting? And so we built like a little app to be able to control lights and all this stuff. And the idea was like, we could have our artists, these kids, teenagers, like come in, do a show, and we would broadcast it to the Boys and Girls Clubs as a way for these kids to express themselves, for their voices to be heard. And so we did it. And it got to the point where it was like, all right, when an artist comes in here and they say what they want to do for the production for their show, we've got to figure out how to do it. We don't say no, we figure out how to do it. So we had this one artist come in and she's like, well, when the chorus drops, she had this song about racism. And she said, like, when the chorus drops, I want like my body to turn into all these different colors. It's called color changes. So like, all right, let's figure out how to do it. So we had an iPad. I'm like, all right, we can use augmented reality and create an AR app, run the iPad through the computer and figure out a way. So when she raised her hands, her body animated all these things like live. It was all live. It was crazy, insane. I had a kid be like, well, we need different perspective camera angles. And I'm like, all right, well, he's like, can I make a virtual drone? I said, all right, go ahead. So model a little virtual drone, figured out to change the gravity so that the camera perspective could fly around. And as we would stream it, it was insane, right? And it was all private to Boys and Girls Club. So funny thing was that year I went to, so that was kind of like me getting red pilled into like the visual side of Web3. And I went, because during COVID, Facebook had their developers conference. So I went to it and they were previewing what's now the metaverse. This is before they rebranded everything to Meta and whatnot. And I went in and I was just into this thing and seeing what they were doing, and ended up, I was literally like picking my nose with my virtual character that I designed to look like my Auntie Holly. And this guy comes up to me and he's, and I start picking his nose in VR, right? Insane. And I ended up picking the nose of the director of Facebook Reality Labs. I started asking questions like, well, how is this stitched together up here? And he starts giving me these answers. And he's like, well, you're asking the craziest questions. He's like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, well, I'm making a metaverse with a bunch of 15-year-old like ninjas. It's super smart dude, super, super nice guy. But it was just like, how are you doing this? And I was like, what if I told you we were doing this with like a laptop or whatever? I said, how much would it cost you to do like a 20-minute show? Not even pre-build, just a production to do a 20. It was like, I don't know, $200,000 or something like that. So he basically said like, well, let's figure out how we can support you. Graciously said, let's figure out how to support you and figure out how to get you gear and money and whatnot to do this. And this is during COVID. Music Foundation was running out of money. And I just kind of went back to the same experience as sitting back in the Facebook headquarters. And I was just like, we're onto something. It's like, I just demoed this thing for probably one of the smartest people in this space in the whole entire world, and threw this guy for a loop. And obviously he probably could figure it out, but he was just like, wait, how you doing your virtual lighting? How you doing it? And the funny thing is, like, this group of kids was called Illusions. It's like, we literally created this metaverse illusion, just these tricks of the eye, like with perspective and all this kind of stuff. So anyways, I decided, I was like, no, I don't want Facebook's money. I don't essentially want to be research and development with a bunch of these teenage kids for Facebook. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And so I basically just didn't follow up and just kind of let the opportunity go. And I questioned myself. It wasn't easy, but I was just like, I can't do this. And soon thereafter, we lost money. We ran out of funding for this program, and I was out of work. And that's when I found Arweave. And so I went to the website, and it literally says like, quit your job, build the future of the internet. And I was just like, well, I don't have work right now. In my head, I was like, this is when the market was good. It's like last November. And I was like, all right, well, I bet you I can make enough money in 6 months, just being super aggressive in a lot of these DeFi things. If I can make enough money in 6 months to like give myself runway for another 6 months, then I can have time to pay myself to like work on this stuff with these kids. And then the market dumped like 2 weeks into November, and I was just like without nothing. So basically since then I've had nothing but the Arweave community. And that's when I found you. Like I'm literally going into Gather Town, and I met you in this community, and now in this crazy journey with Spider. All these like things, like these problems and community building, and this theme of like being in around people that don't look like me, don't talk like me, aren't my same age, all this kind of stuff. It's like this theme in my life that keeps coming back, and now Spider's like bringing it all together.
Yeah, that's cool. And you're talking about how in your presentation, one of the goals of Spider is to make sure that the results aren't biased, aren't siloed, aren't like algorithmically driven, which was kind of manifested in all these kids having the same taste and kind of generic, middle of the road, similar trap music. Not that stuff is bad, but a lot of it does sound like technically very similar. And so your background has a really interesting functionality in having a reason why something like Spider is so useful. Do you want to talk a little bit about it like you did in the Web Foundry and some of the philosophy behind that project?
Yeah.
I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing is like, I'm a product guy and marketing person or whatever. It's like product market fit. Like, what does that look like? And I think for me, it's like I've spent the last 15 years in mentoring young inner city kids. It's like, I've kind of like, my perspective is like, I can kind of think like a young 15-year-old kid. And the way that they see the world is in plain sight. But for our generation and older, it seems crazy. Like metaverse stuff, it just seems like a toy, which is every disruptive technology sounds like that. So it's like, I have to constantly push myself and building with kids, like they're ninjas, super smart, but to me, it's like they represent like the next generation's voice and what is going to be normal and how they're going to collaborate and work together on the internet and how, what does it look like to do that in a quote unquote like gaming environment and all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of the lens that I look at everything through now, especially with Web3 and technology and all this kind of stuff. But the problem that Spider is trying to solve is like this idea of centralized data and these big Web2 companies harvesting and monetizing end user data, and the people basically becoming the product. And I can't fault these companies, the Googles and the TikToks and whatever from doing this, because their job is they're incentivized to provide value for their board and stockholders or whatever. And they do a really good job at it. And they do a really good job at recommending content to people and all this kind of stuff. But we, the people, our data is being, we're not in any control of it, and we see time and time again, like from a user perspective, how we aren't in control of that, whether it's losing everything or whatnot. And we see all this crazy geopolitical stuff that can happen when big companies can change the discourse of society and culture. So the big problem we're trying to solve is like, how do you create like you flip that market incentive instead of the traditional market? Well, I'll say this. Web 1, the internet was first devised or communally contributed to be an open, buildable marketplace of innovations, right? And then Web 2, the Googles and whatnot kind of co-opted that, figure out how to make things faster, cheaper, and thus maintain almost all the control over everything. And it's great because you can, if you have the next Instagram, you can spin it up on Amazon Web Services and have it scale to 200 million people in 2 weeks. But like our data is we're not in control of it, right? And I think everybody in the Arweave community understands that. The second problem that we're trying to solve with Spider is this idea of of your interests, right? So this idea of your interests having value, basically your interests meaning like your motivations, the stuff that you enjoy, whether it's what you're learning about or what you're building, or what you're listening to. It's like the more that Web3 and blockchain scales, it's like, well, we all know like everything's going to become an NFT at some point. It's like, I don't know when it is. You're not going to be able to get a haircut without like using an NFT to pay for it or something in 5 years. But right now, these like primitives of like things that we identify as things that we want to associate ourselves with to become our identity, whether it's a profile picture or a music song or whatever it is, it's like there's on-chain data that goes along with that. So how can we create like a people-powered market that flips this marketplace incentive from providing all the value to the big companies and passes that value in a self-sovereign, self-identified way to users, in a way that they can curate and discover their own stuff, and then be able to connect what we're calling webs, interconnect other people's webs together. And at that point, this market, this automated market maker, like turns into a prediction market. So this all kind of ties together with this idea of creating an automated market maker that's built on top of current technologies that the ecosystem has with COI, proof of real traffic and all these different things. But how can we use these DeFi mechanisms and there's a lot of people talking about this, but how can we take these DeFi primitives that are super innovative, that are used for, financial applications, and how can you take the same type of thinking and apply it to solve other problems, other coordination problems besides like earning yield on some DeFi asset or something? So, so that's the problem that we're trying to solve. And to me, it's like when you're connecting people's interests together in this like decentralized marketplace of interests, what we call an index, which is kind of a play on words, like an index via search and indexing data. But the DEX, a decentralized index, typically is what you call in DeFi, a DEX. It's a decentralized exchange of interests. So creating this index that's powered by people's self-sovereign data, where they're incentivized in a gamified way to curate their web, share their web, and discover other people's content so that they can further their exploration journey.
There's all this interesting stuff on Arweave, and there's all these worlds and all these people. So you're kind of trying to connect the dots, but in a different way, making it so that stuff is not just mysteriously out there. Is that part of it?
One like design goal that I have is like breaking these big picture things down into tiny little builds, and have those builds be able to provide value and have utility like right now, and not be like, oh, we're going to build this for 3 years and then release it, but like build it in public, build it with community, and have each one of these different like access points, I guess you could say, like have a real utility and value for that people would attribute value to. So one of those things is this whole idea kind of centers around this user interface that it resembles a spider web. So if you watch my demo, it's basically 8 nodes with one in the middle that represent 8 spider legs and how they weave webs. And the idea is each one of those nodes represents one of your self-sovereign, like self-identified interests. It's not one of these algorithmic blockchain things, because obviously with blockchain ledger, it's like all your data is out there, right? And I think a problem, this is a whole nother topic, but a problem with all your data being out there, unless you have stuff on zero knowledge proof and all that kind of stuff, but with your data being out there, it's like anybody can create these curation networks, like algorithmic stuff to paint their picture of who you are and blockchain. But to me, it's like, that's kind of not solving the problem. It's like kind of potentially creating an even greater problem than having like 5 companies do that. Now it's like anybody's portraying like your identity with algorithmic blockchain technology. And what does that look like in 10 years, right? But with Spider, it's like your self-sovereign, self-identified interest. So you take something that you have in your wallet, let's say a piece of music or an NFT or a DAO holding or a POAP or a credential or something, and you stake it to the center of your web, and what we're calling PIDs or permaweb IDs. which is literally the center of SPIDR, SPIDER. So you stake your interest token to your web, and then basically when you stake that interest token to your web, you're then connected to everybody else that staked that interest token to their web. Very simple. But with this user interface, it presents like different access points to like engage with Web3. And with where we're at right now and where we're going with VR and AR and WebXR and all this kind of stuff, it's like, and again, me trying to push myself and change my own perspective, like looking at the world through the perspective of a 14-year-old kid, it's like we need user interfaces. We have the opportunity to take all of these amazing like UX, UI stuff that we've learned and got really good at analyzing in Web 2 and kind of presenting them in new ways that make use of the blockchain now. So with SPIDR, we have this SPIDR web user interface. And to me, it's like this design mechanism can represent so many different things. And at first, what we're planning on doing is having this like 8-node SPIDR web basically be just like a single player experience that can you can curate your interest to this thing. And it's a way for you to like express your interest, kind of almost like a bookmarking tool type thing. But it acts as a gate. So it acts like as like a gateway into said experience. So one thing I want to revisit is this idea of like my days when I was thinking about this, 15 years ago, whatever it was in school, of like generative music. So what would it look like to have like each one of these nodes, these little circles, be represented as like a 15-second like drum loop, right? And what does it look like to curate your little web as like these different music loops? And now your web has this generative soundtrack that is constantly changing. And maybe depending on like what community you log into or Discord channel you're in, now your soundtrack is like generatively changing and adapting to whatever other people have their music loops in that Discord channel or this metaverse experience or whatever. And it creates this like, again, like SPIDR being a gamified experience, creates this like this exploratory gamified type experience of exploring the web. But now you have this like this generative music soundtrack that's changing and is represented by like staking music loops, for instance, in your web as like one interest type of example. But yeah, so the first thing is like building this web as a single player thing, people staking their interest to it, and basically leveraging that as like a gate, almost like a crypto captcha tool, where it's like in order to get into maybe a Discord channel or a protocol or a show, whatever it is, it's like you need to have X amount of things like in your web. Where it becomes really interesting is like now you add like multiplayer, like multi-sig thing to this web, and now it's like, all right, in order to get into this event, even it could be in real life, doesn't have to all be on the internet, but in order to get into this web, I'm into this event, like, 9 of these people represented in the SPIDR all have to have a certain NFT or a certain credential or whatever. And now when the SPIDR web, this multi-sig thing, has all those things happen, like, then you get access. So it's acting as this like gate or like crypto capture type tool. And now then you go one step further and you start looking at like what Redstone's doing with VRF, like randomizing on-chain stuff. It's like now this web can start spinning and you have kind of randomized, like gamified access points into different experiences. It's like endless amount of stuff, but just starting with this user interface as like a design mechanism and letting the community figure out what are these things of value that we can create right now and put it out there like in a matter of months, and not just like, oh, we're going to build this thing for 5 years.
That's cool. So where can people follow the progress on it? At
Open Web Foundry, I launched the Twitter, which is at search, but it's at S3ARCH. Or they can go to SPIDR, SPID3R.io. And then my Twitter handle is at voicesofhim. The phases of this thing is to start it as a single player experience. The second phase would be adding a multiplayer experience where you can search and discover other people's interests. And this web becomes this like interconnected, like relational database of people's interests that you can stake into your interests. And once you stake to your interests, they're earning points for their views. This idea, going back to this theme of like your point of view. And once you have this critical mass, this network effect of enough people indexing their interest into this decentralized exchange of interest, now all of a sudden you have like this search engine that kind of appears in the same way that, Google, YouTube, which started off as like an online dating site, is now like the number 2 search engine in the world because enough people are putting everything on there. And same way, like TikTok is now emerging as a search engine. Now, if you want to figure out how to make pancakes with a hammer, you go on TikTok to figure out how to do that, right? So when you have this network effect and enough people indexing their self-sovereign interests, now all of a sudden you have this like emergence of a protocol, people-powered search engine or search and discovery tool that can be built on and adopted by other blockchains and other communities. And the endpoint there is creating this access point, hoping to be able to build it out with R.io as a gateway where people can go to S3AR.ch, and AR is in the middle of it, in the middle of the search, which is cool. And search becomes like the gateway to this experience, and the spider becomes like the gate to the gateway. And the last thing I'll say is like, the super cool thing is like, and kind of figuring out how to search and explore the web via this user interface that right now I'm building out in WebXR, meaning it can be interacted with on the phone, on your computer, in VR, in AR down the line. You can actually step into the web, and instead of looking at it in web view, you can look at it in world view. So now you can go inside these nodes or inside these little domes. And now you're inside of this community of people that share the same interest, but now you're in a metaverse type experience. So you can imagine like people that all share an artist loops, and they're in this room and music's generatively changing and blah, 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 blah. And they're inside the metaverse, whether they're in VR or on a phone, doesn't so much matter. But to me, it's like, that's the end game there, is looking at how can we use the coordination tools that are around now via Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Arweave? How do you build upon those things through the perspective of Arweave with DataFi and PermaWeb, all these things that I believe is like the next generation of the internet. It's like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Arweave. And how can you create these completely decentralized like metaverse experiences where you're bringing people together via interests into a room for them to do whatever, for them to invent. In the same way that I met you in GatherTown and we're now here a couple months later, like what does it look like to like have people be in control of their interests, meeting people and doing whatever? And that to me is like the promise of this idea of the town square that gets thrown out a lot. But like in the Renaissance period, we have, philosophers with mathematicians and theologians and scientists, like all in the town square, literally like drinking wine together and completely changing society because they were in the shared experience. So what does it look like to create that experience? And then lastly, what does it look like to unite people with like what my friend is calling minimum viable interests? So where the old market way, Web 2 way of doing things was like you divide people, you segment them into tiny little interests so that you can better serve ads and make money off of ads. And thus now you have society that's segmented and polarized into these tiny groups of people that are like living their whole entire life through one perspective, one worldview, and we have people fighting each other in the streets because of it. And a lot of it is because of technology. So what does it look like in decentralizing that and having people interacting, collaborating in shared experiences, whether it's in VR and a metaverse or just in a 2D view of meeting people? But what does it look like to like have people incentivized to share the same mission to push their self-sovereign interest together? So me and you may hate each other on Twitter, never come in contact with each other on Twitter because it's not algorithmically set up like that. But with Spider, it's like we could find each other through this minimum viable interest, and we're both incentivized through this gamified, automated market maker experience to create and collaborate and build upon the shared interests so that interest provides value to the world. And that to me is like, now you're getting back to this thing of like, me being in just my life experience to constantly be throwing in these situations where of people groups that I don't quote unquote belong, but recognizing that everybody just wants the same thing. We all want freedom. And it doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left or live in this country or this age or this race. It's like fundamentally, it's like we all want freedom. And with like the power of Arweave specifically and data, it's like we have the opportunity to create like a people-powered market so that marketplace can create whatever they want and have complete ownership over it. So that's kind of like the high level tying everything together and what we're trying to do with SPID3R.
What you're doing is really interesting and exciting, and it sums up a lot of the philosophy of why I'm excited about all this stuff. And I appreciate you, Ryan. You're a thoughtful guy, and this is a really good interview. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, man. At some point in the future, we'll do a metaverse show. We'll be in the metaverse, and you can be rapping, and I'll be in a band with my kids, crushing it.
That'll be tight. That sounds good. Well, I'll be sure to keep your eye on SPID3R, and we'll keep you updated on Ryan's great creativity. Thanks, everyone.
I appreciate you, brother.
Ryan has good morals and great project ideas. Thanks for being on, dude. Be sure to tune in next time for more updates on the community. Be sure to keep participating in Inferno and know before you stow. This is the end of the show. Thanks, everyone.